They say numbers can't capture terror. But consider this. By the end of the Second World War, Britain's Lancaster bombers had dropped more than 600,000 tons of bombs across Nazi Germany. Entire cities, Hamburg, Cologne, Dresden, were reshaped into oceans of fire. For the men who flew them and the civilians who hid beneath their thunder, the Lancaster was more than just a machine. It was a symbol of power, of vengeance, of sacrifice. The Avro Lancaster was unlike anything the world had seen before. With its cavernous bomb bay, it could carry the heaviest payload of the war, up to 22,000 pounds. This flying fortress of steel and rivets wasn't just a bomber. It was Britain's sharpest blade, forged in the dark days when the nation stood alone against Hitler. But its story isn't one of cold statistics alone. Behind the whine of its Merlin engines were young men, most barely out of school, sent into night skies thick with flak and enemy fighters. For every mission flown, death stalked the crew in silence. Nearly half of all Lancaster airmen would never return home. The Lancaster is remembered as Britain's most feared weapon of the air war. But the truth of how it was built, how it fought, and what it cost is far more haunting. This is the story of the Lancaster bomber and the men who turned darkness into fire. The year was 1940. Britain stood in the shadow of annihilation. France had fallen. The swastika flew over Europe. Across the English Channel, Hitler's armies stretched from Norway's frozen fjords to the burning sands of North Africa. Britain was the last major power holding out against the Reich, and the skies above became the battlefield that would decide its survival. The geography was unforgiving. Britain itself was a fortress island, surrounded by cold seas and battered by unpredictable weather. To the east, only 20 miles of water separated Dover's white cliffs from the occupied French coast. Beyond that, German industry churned day and night, producing tanks, aircraft, and weapons in staggering numbers. If Britain could not strike back, defeat was only a matter of time. For the Royal Air Force, the challenge was immense. Fighter Command had defended the island during the Battle of Britain, but fighters alone could not end the war. The only way to break Germany's back was to reach deep into its heart, into the Ruhr, the industrial engine of Hitler's empire. Yet this meant flying over hundreds of miles of hostile territory. Thick belts of searchlights, radar towers, and anti-aircraft batteries, with night fighters lurking in the darkness. Germany valued its factories, oil plants, and rail networks as the arteries of war. Britain knew if these could be shattered, the Reich would bleed. What was at stake was not simply victory or defeat, but survival itself. And so, Britain turned to a new kind of weapon, one that could carry destruction farther, faster, and heavier than ever before. A machine that would change the very nature of the air war, the Lancaster bomber. The Lancaster was not born out of triumph, but out of failure. In the late 1930s, Britain had placed its hopes on the twin-engine Manchester bomber, a sleek design on paper, but a disaster in the skies. Its engines were unreliable, its range too short, and crews called it a death trap. Yet from its flawed frame, engineers at Avro found the seed of something greater. By stretching its wings, redesigning the fuselage, and fitting 4 of Rolls-Royce's legendary Merlin engines, they created a new aircraft, the Lancaster. It entered service in 1942, and with it came a new doctrine of war. The men chosen to fly her were drawn from across the empire: Britons, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, even volunteers from occupied nations. Most were barely 20 years old. They trained in bitter cold airfields scattered across England. Places like Scampton, Waddington, and Woodhall Spa. Long runways carved into farmland, surrounded by barbed wire and watchtowers, became home. Training was relentless. Crews drilled in navigation, gunnery, and bomb aiming until exhaustion blurred the lines of day and night. They were ordered to trust each other completely. For once in the air, survival depended not on one man, but on 7 souls working as one. Pilots learned to guide the heavy bomber through blind darkness. Gunners practiced firing at painted targets to simulate enemy fighters. Bomb aimers rehearsed the delicate art of precision, though in reality, fog, smoke, and flak would make accuracy a cruel illusion. Commanders like Air Chief Marshal Sir Arthur Bomber Harris believed the Lancaster was the key to breaking Germany's will. His strategy was clear: not just to destroy factories, but to terrorize the cities that fed the Nazi war machine. To Harris, the bomber offensive was Britain's chance to strike back with fire and steel. But critics warned of terrible civilian losses, and of whether young crews could survive repeated missions into the very heart of the Reich. Intelligence, too, was imperfect. Radar coverage was underestimated. The strength of the Luftwaffe's night fighters was often misjudged. Briefings painted routes as achievable, but the men who studied the maps knew every red circle, every flak concentration, was a potential graveyard. On the ground, the mood before each operation was tense, cloaked in silence. The clatter of typewriters echoed through command huts as orders were written. Mechanics tightened bolts under floodlights, the smell of oil and sweat thick in the night air. Inside wooden barracks, crews smoked in silence, some writing final letters they hoped would never be delivered. The Lancaster stood ready on the runway, its dark shape glistening under the moonlight, bomb bay yawning open like the jaws of some steel beast. Engines would soon roar, propellers slicing the night. The first mission was no longer an idea, it was about to begin. When the Lancasters finally took to the skies, Britain's vengeance became a living, thundering force. At dusk, airfields across Lincolnshire and Yorkshire shook with the roar of engines as black silhouettes lifted one by one into the night. From the ground, they looked like a stream of steel shadows, stretching to the horizon. From the cockpit, the view was a different kind of terror, an endless ocean of cloud and darkness, pierced only by the glow of moonlight on the wings. The first mission seemed deceptively straightforward. Crews carried out raids on the Ruhr Valley, striking Essen, Duisburg, and Dortmund. Searchlights probed the heavens, beams converging like white daggers. Anti-aircraft guns spat fire into the sky, filling the air with deadly shrapnel. Yet still, bombs rained down, and photographs showed black scars spreading across the Reich's industrial heart. To the British public, it seemed like the tide had turned. Newspapers spoke of precision attacks, of German industry crippled. For a moment, there was hope. But the truth in the skies was far darker. German defenses adapted with frightening speed. Radar stations along the coast tracked bomber streams as they crossed the channel. Night fighters, twin-engine Messerschmitts and Junkers bristling with cannons, slipped silently into the bomber routes, striking from below in sudden bursts of flame. Whole aircraft vanished in seconds, swallowed by fire. Crews learned to dread the invisible hunter, whose guns tore through fuselages before anyone could react. The weather, too, turned against them. Icy winds froze instruments, clouds scattered formations, and storms drove bombers off course. Navigators fought to plot routes through turbulence, while bomb aimers stared down at endless blackness, unable to see their targets. Bomb loads often fell wide, destroying homes and churches instead of factories. In those moments, the cost of strategic bombing became brutally clear, not just for German civilians, but for the young men forced to carry out the orders. Still, there were flashes of triumph. One raid on Essen crippled parts of the Krupp armament works, slowing tank production. Another struck Cologne, marking the first 1,000-bomber raid, an operation so vast that it seemed to shake the very earth. For the crews who returned, these victories felt like proof that their suffering had meaning. But for every Lancaster that made it home, another lay broken in a field or burning in a city street. Losses mounted. Hope, once bright, dimmed with every empty bunk in the barracks, every breakfast table missing a familiar face. And yet, commanders pressed forward. The strategy demanded escalation. Larger raids, deadlier payloads, deeper strikes into Germany itself. The war of fire was only beginning, and what lay ahead would eclipse even the darkest nights so far. By 1943, the air war had reached its boiling point. The Lancaster was no longer a newcomer. It was the spearhead of Bomber Command, carrying destruction deeper into Germany than any aircraft before it. And with each passing month, the missions grew deadlier, more ambitious, more merciless. The most infamous came in July of that year, Operation Gemara, the firebombing of Hamburg. Night fell. More than 700 bombers lifted off from Britain, engines trembling through the humid summer air. Each Lancaster carried a mix of high-explosive bombs and thousands of incendiaries, small, magnesium-filled canisters designed not to destroy with a single blast, but to ignite 1,000 fires that would join into one. Pilots and bomb aimers studied their maps in silence. Gunners scanned the horizon for the first flicker of enemy wings. The crews knew few would come back. As they crossed the coast, the first flak batteries opened up. Black puffs erupted around the bombers, shaking fuselages, rattling loose bolts. The smell of cordite filled the cabins. Searchlights stabbed upward, locking onto the dark underbellies of aircraft. Then came the fighters, Bf-110s and Ju-88s sliding out of the night, cannons blazing. Lancasters fell in flames, screaming down into the sea. But the stream pushed on, wave after wave. Over Hamburg, the bomb bay doors yawned open. Explosives shattered water mains and tore apart buildings, clearing the way for the incendiaries. Then the firebombs fell. Thousands of them. They clattered across rooftops, exploded in showers of white-hot magnesium, and set entire neighborhoods alight. The city itself began to burn, first in pockets, then in blocks. Then, as the wind fed the flames, in one monstrous inferno, crews looked down in awe and horror. They could see the firestorm forming, flames towering hundreds of feet into the sky. The heat was so intense that air currents dragged oxygen into the city, creating a roaring hurricane of fire. Streets melted. Asphalt bubbled. Civilians who sought shelter in basements suffocated as oxygen was sucked away. Those outside were pulled into the flames by the winds themselves. In one night, tens of thousands perished. But the bombers did not escape untouched. The Germans struck back with everything they had. Radar-guided flak stitched the night sky. Night fighters prowled relentlessly. Lancaster after Lancaster was ripped apart, breaking into burning fragments before the eyes of their own squadron mates. Crews who had shared meals hours earlier now vanished in fireballs that lit the darkness. The survivors pressed on, knowing turning back was not an option. This was the rhythm of the bomber war. Chaos, desperation, bravery in the face of almost certain death. Each side adapting, each side bleeding. For every German city reduced to rubble, Britain's squadrons paid in burned-out wrecks and empty bunks. For every factory destroyed, another crew never returned. The climax was not a single night, but a long, grinding crescendo of destruction. Raids on Essen, Nuremberg, Berlin, all carried the same pattern. Walls of flak, endless darkness, sudden death, and at last, the orange glow of flames spreading below. But Hamburg was different. In its wake, a terrible truth became clear to all. The bomber offensive could not be stopped. The Reich cities would burn one by one. And the men inside the Lancasters realized something equally chilling. Victory was coming, yes, but at a cost so immense it would haunt them for the rest of their lives. By 1944, the Lancaster had become the hammer striking the heart of Germany night after night. Cities that once gleamed with lights and industry were reduced to blackened skeletons. Hamburg was a ruin. Cologne had been shattered. Berlin itself, once thought untouchable, now lay in smoldering heaps. But the cost was staggering. Of the 125,000 men who served in bomber command, more than 55,000 never came home. Entire crews were lost in single fiery moments. Aircraft exploding in midair, plummeting into fields, or vanishing into the sea. Survivors spoke of returning to empty barracks, beds stripped bare, silence filling the spaces once alive with laughter. The Lancaster had given Britain the power to strike back, but every mission demanded blood. Notable raids carried their own legacies. The Dambusters of 617 Squadron, using the Lancaster to breach the Great Ruhr Dams with Barnes-Wallis's bouncing bomb, became legends. Yet many of those men would later perish in subsequent missions, their glory fleeting in the relentless grind of war. Air Chief Marshal Arthur Bomber Harris pressed on with his strategy, convinced that bombing alone could cripple the Reich. His name would forever be bound to both Britain's survival and the devastation of Germany's cities. The immediate consequences were undeniable. German industry staggered. Oil refineries, rail networks, and armament plants lay in ruins. Thousands of enemy aircraft sat grounded for lack of fuel. By the time Allied armies landed in Normandy, the Luftwaffe was a shadow of its former self, unable to contest the skies in strength. The Lancaster had done its part. It had broken Germany's capacity to wage modern war. But beneath the triumph, the survivors carried scars invisible to medals or parades. The War of Fire had ended, but its ashes still smoldered. The Lancaster's legacy is carved into both steel and memory. For Britain, it was the weapon that carried the fight across the Channel when no other option remained. It gave the nation a way to strike back, to prove that Hitler's empire was not invincible. In that sense, it became a symbol of resilience and vengeance. But history remembers with a divided heart. To some, the Lancaster embodies courage. Crews who climbed into the night knowing half would never return, yet went anyway. Their sacrifice is honored at memorials across Britain and the Commonwealth, where names of the fallen stretch longer than runways themselves. To others, the Lancaster is a reminder of the terrible price of total war. The firestorms of Hamburg, the ruins of Dresden, These are scars still etched into Europe. The strategy of area bombing, born in desperation, left questions of morality that echo to this day. Did it hasten victory, or did it trade one horror for another? Yet the lessons remain. The Lancaster showed the power of air supremacy, the scale of destruction a single machine could unleash, and the human cost bound to every mission. In the quiet today, when a restored Lancaster's engines rumble over memorial fields, the sound carries more than nostalgia. It is a reminder of courage, of loss, of fire, and of a haunting truth, that in war, even victory can burn.